My name is Olivia Haynes, and I'm the director of the Sanford C. Bernstein and Company Center for Leadership and Ethics at Columbia Business School. And on behalf of the center and our co-sponsors, the Chazen Institute for Global Business, the African Business Club, and Global Citizenship, I am pleased to welcome you all here to our event on authentic disruption in South Africa, a fireside chat with Magda Wierzycka, co-founder and chief CEO of Sygnia Limited, and Donald Weiss, professor of business at Columbia Business School. Today's conversation will focus on her fight for ethical business leadership and diverse representation in South Africa, and is also a part of the Phillips Pathway for Inclusive Leadership program, focusing on the DEI essential skill sets and topics of addressing systemic inequity and communicating across identities, as well as gender and racial equity and global citizenship. If you are attending today's session for PPL credit, please check in using the link in the chat box, and don't forget to submit your post-event reflection form to satisfy the community-wide mandate. Additionally, this event will take place in two sections. First, Magda will share her life story for the first half hour of our time together, and then we will transition to a moderated Q&A with Professor Weiss. If you have any questions along the way, please feel free to send them through the chat box, which will be monitored by your host, and we will also plan on taking live student questions. And now, I am happy to introduce our moderator, Donald Weiss. Since 1998, he has been an adjunct professor of entrepreneurship at CBS, as well as the owner of Bowright Realty and W&B Holdings, both commercial real estate firms. He is a proud alum of the business school and was also awarded the prestigious Botwinick Prize for Business Ethics given out by the Bernstein Center as the former owner and CEO of White Systems, Inc. He has known Magda for quite some time and generously helped us with this invitation today for her to speak with you all. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Professor Weiss, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you. I was fortunate enough to meet Magda Wierzycka in Cape Town, South Africa, when I taught the Global Week for 6 years. Magda was the highlight of the sessions that she attended by my judgment and by judgment of the class. You're going to hear an abbreviated story of succeeding against heavy odds as an immigrant, as a woman, as a lonely but relentless crusader for corporate responsibility, and ultimately a story of toppling a government, an evil government. I don't want to take another minute of Magda's time, so here is Magda.
Dan, thank you very much, and guys, thank you for joining me at what I know is a very, very early time in New York. So without further ado, I just wanted to start the talk a little bit by commenting on what we're living through. And, we're living through, as you all know, something that is probably a once in a lifetime event for us. And, I do believe that the world will never be the same post this pandemic. There will be so many systemic and structural changes. And I just thought that, as an introduction to my talk, which is kind of pertinent. And that is an image that you will see behind me, which I'm very proud acquirer of. I know it's probably not a very good representation of it. There's a little bit of light on it, but it's basically Andy Warhol's Lenin. And I can't think of greater irony, particularly given the times we're living in, than this commerger of communism and capitalism kind of rolled into one image. So here you have the epitome of capitalism in terms of being able to spend money on art and gratuitous art, and at the same time representing Lenin, who stood for something completely different. And I think that dichotomy is what we will have to grapple with post-COVID pandemic, because the global inequality has increased exponentially in the last year. Absolutely exponentially, and we haven't seen the effects of it just yet, but they are coming. So on that note, I think that leadership, management of businesses, the way you present yourself, the way you take yourself forward, the way you take your businesses forward will have to change and adjust. In terms of my own story, Lenin is a little bit pertinent because I was born in communist Poland. back in just past 1970s. So I grew up in Poland in a 60 square meter apartment, shared with, two siblings together with a grandmother, as those families used to live. The communism that I lived under was a system where, 90% of the people had exactly the same. So everyone lived in teeny tiny apartments. No one had a car. No one, for that matter, had bank accounts. So financial services was not something that really was at the forefront of communism. But at the same time, we had this 10% of the population who belonged to the Communist Party, led the country, and held all the power. And then when communism started collapsing, and it collapsed for one reason and one reason only, and that is effectively communism ran out of money. So the system where you can provide free education, free healthcare, and a job to everybody is unsustainable economically and financially. And, when communism effectively ran out of money, so did food, and so did access to resources that the country had, and waves of people illegally left Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia in those days. And, I landed up, so did my parents. We left Poland overnight, crossed the border illegally, landed up in a refugee camp in Austria, the same refugee camp that the Syrian refugees are actually being housed in today. And we spent about a year in that refugee camp applying to countries which accept immigrants. So United States is one of them, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. And at the same time, the South African government, which was still very much in the throes of apartheid, realized that in these refugee camps, they had engineers and medical doctors and architects. And so the National Party government, South Africa, sent out representatives to the Vienna embassy. They put up posters in the refugee camp saying they're recruiting people for medical doctors, engineers, and so on. And my parents, being faced with the choice of going to United States and possibly digging ditches, which they were busy doing in Austria, and they're medical doctors, by the way, and coming to South Africa to a ready-made job, ended up, choosing South Africa without us knowing anything about the political system in this country. So I arrived in South Africa at the age of 12, didn't know the language. And, I have to say, the next few years are not particularly interesting. I mean, the typical years that an immigrant lives through, you basically have to learn the language. Your parents don't have much time for you because they have to literally recreate their lives. And we arrived here with $500 and a grandmother and 3 children. So you learn to be self-sufficient very, very quickly on. And in fact, you again, not a similar story for many immigrants. And I'm sure it might resonate with some of you, you end up kind of parenting your parents because you tend to learn the language faster than they do, learn the system a little bit faster, and hence you become an adult very quickly. And then, we really didn't have any money for me to go to university. So, but fortuitously, someone told me that there is this course of study called actuarial science. I know it exists in the United States. It's slightly different in terms of the British South African qualification. It's basically kind of a life insurance, statistics, mathematics, stroke investments, and economics degree. But it's people who run life insurance companies, hold the actuarial science degrees. And someone told me, that very difficult. You had to have top marks in mathematics, top marks in English, but there were bursaries on offer, which paid for the entire studies. And, I applied for one of those bursaries. To this day, given my broken English at that stage, I'm not quite sure how I got that bursary, but I did get the bursary. And I studied at University of Cape Town. And straight from Cape Town, I had to work. I worked in supermarkets. I worked, I needed money to survive. So I can honestly say that from the age of 18, I've been completely financially self-supporting. And then, when I finished my university degree and board exams to become an actuary, I started working in a life insurance company. And, here is the first lesson. I was probably 23 at that stage, and I very quickly realized, and, it's really scanning your environment. The work was boring. I was surrounded by people who were much brighter than me, and they actually could use a computer, which I couldn't, which wasn't a good thing. And so, I scanned the environment and decided that, I needed to move to another division. And so I researched the various divisions that, kind of made up a life insurance company and managed to wangle my way into the investments division. And that was really the beginning of my journey in asset management and managing assets and finance. And then very quickly after that, again, looking at the fact that I just happened to end up in a very, an interesting life insurance company, which was actually about to go bust. I managed to convince CEO of another firm, a kind of investment consulting firm, to hire me, and they hired me. They didn't know why they hired me, but I started honing my marketing skills. So that's yet another lesson in life. Learn to speak with confidence, learn to communicate, in an articulate manner. So as an example, I took my kids when they were 6 years old and sent them to acting classes, not because I expect them to be actors, but because I wanted them to learn how to communicate, how to debate, how to express themselves with confidence at a young age. That's key to joining the workforce, sitting in a boardroom and being able to contribute your ideas in a meeting. So I lasted in the investment consulting firm. I ended up consulting to some very large pension funds very early on in my career, about the age of 25. And the thing that carried me through, surprisingly, was my actuarial qualification. There weren't a lot of actuaries. Certainly, I was one of 3 women actuaries or female actuaries in South Africa, and hence no one kind of cared that I was, a blonde 26-year-old. The fact that I was an actuary actually meant something. But, I very quickly realized, and that's also a decision that you need to make for yourself, whether corporate life is something that you want or whether an entrepreneurial life is something that you want. And incidentally, the two don't commingle. And there's no right or wrong answer, as I always say to people. Some people absolutely thrive in a corporate environment. So it's a large company, you know where you stand, you climb your way to the top, and you have to deploy various techniques to achieve that kind of, progress in a corporate. Diplomacy, knowing, who to suck up to, if you have to suck up to. And then there is the entrepreneurial route, and the entrepreneurial route is different. The entrepreneurial route is a route of many sacrifices that you have to make, financial being one of them. And you have to be a risk taker. And some people are not, and which is also perfectly fine. But, the entrepreneurial route does not come without risk. And so when I was 26, I was approached by kind of a group of 5 guys who started an asset management company, and they wanted to manage money, and they needed someone to run the business side of their little startup. And because they kind of perceived me as the actuary, and I knew finance, and I kind of seemed to know what I'm talking about, they said to me, Magda, please come and join us. We can't pay you what you're earning now. So I took a massive cut in my salary. But we'll pay you bonuses if you succeed, or if we succeed collectively. We'll run the investments, you run everything else. And of course, everything else turned out to be finance and legal and administration and marketing and business development and people management, and the regulatory side of the business. But it was the greatest MBA I could have had at the age of 26, because literally no one cared what I did. I call it the Great Wild West. As long as I was bringing in clients and, assets under management were growing, I was given complete and absolute freedom. And, so that was a great learning experience. But I was still not particularly, I always had a passion for economics. I obviously sat on the investment meetings just out of interest, but I was still not a particularly politically aware person at that stage. And then that changed, 6.5 years into that career path. The person who actually truly owned the business decided to IPO the business. And that's when I learned the difference between being told you're an owner and actually being an owner. So if someone doesn't give you a share certificate, you're not an owner, you're just an employee. So when I found out that I was just an employee, I decided to resign. And I decided to start my own business. And I was 32. And very quickly I learned that, 32, it's young to start a business, unless if you don't have any capital backing you. And, there was no such thing as venture capital in South Africa. It doesn't exist today either. So, whatever business you started, you did it with a bank loan, a mortgage bond actually on your house. And you have to think, long and hard about wanting to start your own business and what skills you need to start your own business, what financial resources you need, because you need that experience. And hence, when I give these lectures, I often tell, young people, gain as much experience, different experience as you can in your 20s and early 30s. It doesn't matter if that experience doesn't pay. It doesn't matter, but put up your hand for everything that is going, because those lessons and those experiences will set you up for life later on and for success later on in life. Too many people prioritize short-term financial gains and a high salary in a boring job ahead of actually gaining, very kind of multiplex and multifold experience, which might not pay as much, but it will pay and reap dividends and rewards later on in life. So I very quickly discovered that starting a business at 32, I was a little bit too young. But then a very interesting thing happened to me, which kind of was a bit of a pivotal thing in my life. And that is I was approached by a gentleman by the name of Mzi Kumalo, and that won't mean anything to you, but he was actually the military commander of the ANC's wing when they were fighting the apartheid government. And Mzi spent, a number of years in Siberia. He became a colonel in the Russian army. He was trained by the Russians. And Mzi spent 13 years on Robben Island together with Nelson Mandela. So, his stories about Nelson Mandela are not to be repeated to anybody, because, Nelson Mandela was also a man. He was an icon and a man. And those two are not necessarily the same thing. But Mzi was determined while he was sitting on Robben Island, remember that was a political prison, to study. So he studied through correspondence, and he was determined to make money the moment he left Robben Island. And he became, and he did exactly that. So the moment, there was the political change in South Africa, he went into business. He was very smart about it, outsmarted everybody else, and he became the first Black billionaire in South Africa, which didn't make him the best businessman, but he did become the first billionaire. And he bought a failing asset management company. He was kind of conned into buying a failing asset management company. And that was right at the time when I started my not that successful business, because never had a chance to really do anything. And he approached me and said to me, Magda, you've got a business, I've got a business, let's make a deal. I didn't have a business. I didn't know that he didn't really have a business. But we exchanged some shares in the equation, and I became a CEO of a company which turned out to be hugely problematic, actually should have been liquidated. But we managed to salvage that company through sheer hard work, grit, determination. And, I always talk about those years as being, my swan years. So on the surface, you are calm and cool and collected, but underneath, your feet are moving like this. But through Mzi, I also became exposed to and educated about politics and about race politics, racial division in the country, inequality in the country. And, it really was an education because, and I know that those issues are now very topical. In South Africa, those issues have been topical for a very long time. But, being a white person in South Africa, you weren't necessarily exposed. Well, you obviously were exposed to what was going on, but there was also a whole lot of propaganda that you grew up with, which you kind of had to unwind. So those 3 years with Mzi were fantastic from that perspective, and he taught me a lot. And possibly some of the things that I did subsequently in my career were, a function of what I learned from him. But, 3 years into restructuring the business, growing the business, he found me one day and he said to me, Magda, it's been, great, but I have now recovered the money I've spent on this business. Please sell this business as quickly as possible. I want my cash. And so, I had to orchestrate an M&A and sell that asset management company. By that stage, that grew to become one of the top 10 asset management companies in South Africa and the only majority Black-owned asset management company. And so, halfway through that transaction, suddenly half of the staff of African Harvest, that's what the company was called, came to me and said to me, Magda, what are we all doing next? And, I kind of looked around and I went, who is we? And everyone said, well, us. Here's a list of people who don't want to be sold. We want to come with you to do whatever you are doing next. And, you have to look at people like that and go, there's a certain so this is your distinguishing characteristic between entrepreneurs and non-entrepreneurs. I would, surmise that absolutely everyone on that list was an entrepreneur, a risk taker, and a little bit crazy, because you do have to be a little bit crazy to abandon a well-paid job, to take on risk, and risk to the extent where you didn't even know what the new business was going to be. But anyway, that was 2006. I quickly had to restructure the transaction, buy out some regulatory licenses, and we set up a financial services company called Sygnia in South Africa. It is now one of the probably top 10 largest asset management groups in the country. It's a broader financial services group than just asset management. We IPO'd the business 2015. I'm still a CEO of that business, but I also have, different business interests. But while running Sygnia, there are certain things that, I'm a firm believer in. And that is, I found my journey through asset management industry as a woman quite tough. And it is a male dominated field. It's a field that doesn't necessarily mollycoddle women. So you literally have to be tough. You've got to get rid of all these things that women have, being overly emotional, taking things personally. You kind of have to learn the skills that it takes to fight your corner. And I decided that, in setting up my own business, I was going to create a completely different culture. So it's a culture of meritocracy, but it's a culture where, we've got huge amount of women in most senior positions, and it really doesn't matter whether you're male, female, black, white, pink, purple. We have a culture of teamwork, of collaboration, and one where really it's multitasking. No job is too small. I never expect anyone to do anything that I wouldn't do myself first. And that it is quite a unique and special culture. And I think has been one of the fundamental cornerstones of our success. But then the more colorful side of my life. So Sygnia has been successful and continues to grow. We also have been, very strong and probably the pioneers of identifying these kind of themes that drive, the for want of a better umbrella term, fourth industrial revolution. And so we very early on, back in mid-2000s, 2015, launched products which talk to digital innovation. So all these things that are coming to the fore right now, we were there in 2015 with products, and we have some, top performing products in South Africa because of recognizing the fact that, technology is going to have a massive, massive impact on the way we live, we work, we interact with each other, Zoom being an example. And hence, if you're not investing in the future, you are going to be left behind. And that was quite a revolutionary thing to think of back in 2015. So we do pride ourselves on this very innovative spirit, which also comes from continuing to view ourselves as entrepreneurs and not as a corporate, despite the fact that, if you looked at Sygnia today, it's a corporate company. And then, when in South Africa was, under Nelson Mandela, was a thriving economy. There was a lot of positivity in air. After Mandela came a more problematic president, Thabo Mbeki, and the problem with him was that he was an unfortunately an AIDS denialist. And there's lots of complicated, intellectual reasons as to why he believed, HIV didn't cause AIDS, and refused to provide medication when medication was available, and 300,000 people died unnecessarily. But he eventually was ousted by one of the biggest crooks South Africa has ever seen, Jacob Zuma, who became a president for the next decade and literally spent his entire time stealing. So he stole not only financially, which he did with collaboration by a family of 3 brothers who came to South Africa. In fact, their father was the main money launderer for organized crime in India. And they came to South Africa with very much the view of how can they take over, and find ways of making money out of a fairly corrupt president. And so it didn't take them long to integrate themselves with Jacob Zuma and structure the affairs of the state in such a way that they could rob state-owned enterprises. So, your electricity generators, your airlines company, your arms manufacturing company. So everywhere where there were big deals on the go. But what was so interesting about that whole decade was that, all that grand theft that happened in South Africa, and, unfortunately, we are going to carry the scars of this for many years to come, would not have happened without the collaboration of multinational companies. So, in every kind of corrupt activity, you have the people soliciting the bribes and the people paying. And people who solicit the bribes, who have power, usually seek out payees who have big checkbooks. And who is bigger than multinational companies? You're not going to be soliciting bribes from some, small operator who puts up fencing, for goodness sake. You are going to solicit bribes from McKinsey, from Bain, from KPMG, from SAP. And, that has been the Deloitte. This has been the thing that happened in South Africa, where all these companies, I remember, once I became vocal about corruption, I remember SAP, so that's a German company which provides all the software. The non-executive director flew out to South Africa, and she phoned me. And she said to me, I'm so vocal on corruption. I'll tell you why I was vocal on corruption. She would like me to know the SAP side of the story in this corrupt activity. And she said to me, Magda, we pay middlemen, that's a nice way of saying we bribe, we pay middlemen to secure business all around the world. So this is a standard business model. However, given what has happened in South Africa, we've decided that we are not going to pay any more bribes in countries which fall below some level 50 on the World Corruption Index. And that has now actually become part of, we have a commission of inquiry into state capture and corruption in South Africa. And I'm just busy testifying now against SAP. So as blatant, they were as blatant as that. McKinsey, unbelievable amounts of money, taking on contracts that they knew were absolute shams. They didn't even pretend to send in people. But they secured those contracts with large state institutions, and then they would share the spoils with the Gupta family, which was this Indian family of 3 brothers, and President Jacob Zuma. So, I became a very vocal critic of government, of Jacob Zuma. And, people were quite surprised because, it's not usual for business to take on government. And, I was called into a meeting by top 80 CEOs of the largest South African companies. And I was asked, Magda, please join us and rather be part of this club. And I said to them, well, what do you intend to do about the fact that the country is spiraling downwards because of the corruption, because of the theft that's going on, because of the mismanagement and I was told, look, we're not really going to do anything because we think you are quite naive business and government coexist. And, business will adjust to which way the wind is blowing. So if a successful way of doing business is to pay bribes to government, that's what business will do. And if, on the other hand, ways to success is to be squeaky clean, then we will swing that way. But if you think we are going to take on government and potentially threaten our government contracts, that's not going to happen. So I obviously said, well, thank you, gentlemen, mostly gentlemen. That's the end of this club. I'm out of here. And, I always said that, I had this great freedom having started my own company and not being dependent on any government contracts to do whatever I wanted. And I never sought out government contracts. So that did give me the freedom to speak out. But, even then, people were looking at me and saying, well, this woman is a little bit crazy. And why is she doing what she's doing? And up until probably 8 months ago, people didn't know why I did what I did. And, the information and stuff I'll tell you now was never supposed to make it into the public domain. Unfortunately, it has made its way into public domain, which kind of gives me the freedom to speak about it. But I never intended it to make its way into public domain. But the reason I became so vocal about corruption was, apart from obviously seeing what was happening and wanting to make a difference and obviously seeing all this wrong around me. But, an interesting thing happened to me. A whistleblower came to me. And that whistleblower was in possession of a hard drive. So this Indian family of the Gupta family had a family compound, and they had a family server on which they kept all the emails going back 5 or 6 years. And that the hard drive of that server burned. And they took it to be repaired. The repairman said it can't be repaired. It's completely burnt out. And they abandoned that drive. He then managed to repair that drive, surprisingly, just as he was basically practicing with screwdrivers. And when he looked at the contents of the drive, he saw evidence. There were 500,000 emails on that drive. And there was evidence of 6 years worth of corruption. There were ministers emailing the Guptas emailing Zumas. The documents, KPMG documents, McKinsey documents, anything and everything documenting the full extent of corruption that has happened under everyone's noses behind the scenes without anyone realizing the extent of it. So not knowing what to do with this, he came to me. And he needed money for safe passage out of South Africa and protection. So I gave him the money and I came into possession of this drive. And, on legal advice, I was told, look, get out of the country, first of all, and then democratize the data. That's the only way of doing it. And long story of various interesting people I met, including lawyers who represent Edward Snowden and Justin Assange, because, I tried WikiLeaks. That turned out to be a bit of a disaster platform. So eventually, in complete desperation, I locked myself in a hotel room in London. And for 5 or 6 days, I went through all 500,000 emails. I organized them into storylines under the names of different ministers, different state-owned enterprises. And then I made a heck of a lot of discs. And I distributed them all around South Africa. I sent those discs to heads of trade unions, to various politicians, to various news outlets. And I just democratized the data while remaining completely anonymous in the process. And I remained anonymous for many years, up until now, in fact. So this happened in 2017. Unfortunately, with all the exposure of corruption in South Africa right now, my name has come up and the story has come up, and it's part of my testimony as well to the Commission of Inquiry. And, that event, obviously I went through 500,000 emails, which was quite boring because a lot of them were really boring. It suddenly lifted a lid on things that, I have never seen before. KPMG as an example. And I'm very happy to talk about these things because no one will sue me for defamation here. KPMG as an example. They were our external auditors at Sygnia. And, audit firms have two arms to them. They've got the audit division, which usually doesn't make a lot of money, and an advisory division, where they advise on corporate transactions, which does make a lot of money. So provided you employ the advisory division, the audit division will comply with whatever the advisory division wants them to do. And that's where a lot of corruption, by the way, comes from, where you see the failures of audit firms in many instances. It comes from the fact that the auditors are willing to overlook what is happening in the company because they're being compensated through their advisory arm, and big money is changing hands on the advisory side. So, KPMG is an example. I called in the head of KPMG in South Africa into my office. And I said to him, I want you to explain to me your activities in relation to the state and to the Guptas. And he said to me, well, there's some rumors, but we are investigating. But as you can appreciate, to recall servers, emails, very difficult. I said to him, well, actually, no, it's not that difficult. Here is a disk with all the evidence on KPMG in my possession. I'm gifting it to you. So you can take action tomorrow against the people implicated. You know what happened? The disk was delivered back to me with a legal letter the next day. And the legal letter basically said, we haven't looked at the disk. We don't want to know what's on it. What we don't know can't hurt us. Well, needless to say, we then fired KPMG. That snowballed into a lot of corporates hiring. All of this came out into the public domain. The managing partner from Netherlands flew down to South Africa, and all of it kind of unfolded. But through that process, I became, again, it was hell of an education in terms of seeing how multinational companies operate. And in all of this, you kind of have to make choices. You have to make choices around, do you want to be on the right side of this equation or the wrong side of the equation? By the way, being on the wrong side of the equation is usually a heck of a lot more profitable than being on the wrong side of the equation. But being on the right side of the equation has meant that, I've met a heck of a lot of interesting people. I have assisted government in dealing with whistleblowers, in handling of whistleblowers since. I have, helped commissions of inquiry into corruption. And I have come into contact with absolutely anyone who is anyone in the South African context. And, I don't believe that, and I think, what makes life interesting is not just money. It's not just about, financial gains, because at the end of the day, you know what? How many sports cars can you own? How many pairs of shoes can you buy? How many handbags can you buy? There must be more to life than just money. You must be able to look at yourself in the mirror in the morning and say, I do things which might be questionable. I do things which are not, fire people or whatever. But on the other side of the scorecard, you have to have things where you can say, I'm proud of myself. And that's an internal dialogue, by the way. That's not, something you put out there. But I think to be a balanced, happy person, you have to have the two sides of the scorecard, and they have to be full. And, that certainly, and then, I do believe that the wheel turns and you reap the rewards of that in weird and wonderful ways. So the type of people I have met through this process of being involved in fighting corruption, and potentially what was perceived as ethical leadership before, but now, it went a lot deeper. I mean, I was followed by state security. My phones were tapped. I've got bodyguards. All of these kind of negative sides of all of this have also come with a lot of positivity, and the fact that I can have influence on what happens in South Africa today. My voice is listened to. I do put forward position papers to government. And, I am taken seriously. So there's a lot of kind of soft things that, come, positive things that come from being in this kind of ethical space. And then, I'll finish the talk with something that I think potentially will resonate with many of you, just because it's a little bit American based. And that is, a couple of years ago, I started a new business in United Kingdom, and it's a venture capital firm. And we've raised quite a lot of money to invest in venture businesses. But I have had a friend, my best friend at University of Cape Town, was a gentleman by the name of Roloff Porter, and some of you might know him, you might know, but not. But effectively, he was one of the founders of PayPal. He then joined Sequoia Capital. He's the managing director of Sequoia Capital in the United States. He was the initial backer of both YouTube and Instagram. So Roloff, for all intents and purposes, is an incredibly successful American businessman. And, when I was setting up but together we started with nothing back in UCT days. And, Roloff is obviously incredibly smart, incredibly talented, incredibly driven. But when I was setting up the venture capital business in London, I went to Palo Alto and San Francisco to see Roloff to get some tips. And, we were driving in his incredible stretch limo. And he was showing me all the coffee shops, by the way, where he met the founder of Twitter and the founder of Instagram, and taking me on a bit of a brag tour around San Francisco. But he said to me, Magda, do you remember when we were at university, we spent hours debating what is truly important in life? Is it fame? Is it power? Is it money? So now here we are, at the age of 50, or I shouldn't have said that, at 35. So 25 years more down the line, what do you think? Which out of the three things that we considered, to be the epitomes of success, power, money, or fame, which one of the three do you think is your driving force and your driving motivation? And I said to him, Roloff, after all these years, it's actually none of the three. It's a fourth pillar, and that is social good. He did then say to me, oh, you can't change the rules of the game. We've been playing this game my entire lives. You can't change the game on me now. And I said to him, actually, it's social good. And that's really the end of my story. I'm happy to take any questions and anything you want to know. I know, it's a little bit of a crazy story.
Olivia, do you want to just take the questions? I see lots of hands up. Do you want to pick the order?
Sure.
So I can't see the questions, so you guys need to ask me the questions.
So Rebecca Manning, was that a hand up or was that just a motion?
Motion clap.
Emotional clap, got it. So if anyone has any questions, just feel free to raise your hand. Kamo?
Hi, thank you. I actually don't have a question, more a comment. I'm actually going to get into trouble because I'm meant to be on another conference call, but I just couldn't peel myself from this conversation with Magda. But just to say, thanks for your generosity, very fascinating discussion. I'm also South African, actually. Went to Pretoria Girls High, went to UCT as well. Exactly. So went to UCT as well and found myself in financial services, etc. It's just quite refreshing just to hear a businesswoman like yourself about your journey. And there's very few, I think, South African business people with influence who basically have the bigger picture in mind and understand both the economic issues in South Africa, the political issues, and just the complexities of all of them. So just kind of saying thank you for your generosity, and hopefully I don't lose my job by sort of joining late on my conference call. But thank you, Magda, very inspirational, and hoping to also, have authentic disruptions as well, similar to you, yeah?
Thanks, Kama, and good luck with your studies.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, we have a question coming in from the chat from Zena. So before you released the documents and emails, did you have a decision point where you weren't sure if you should just pretend you never saw it? did you ever think of turning back?
No, I didn't think of turning back. So the moment, I became exposed, I mean, it was a little bit more of a complicated story because there was a whistleblower. There were also some journalists involved because he initially went to some journalists who obviously didn't have the money to fund him on, and they came to me and brought this whistleblower to me. And, when I listened to all these people, and it's interesting because you always think of whistleblowers as heroes, and not all whistleblowers are heroes. People are often motivated by different things. So for instance, the conversations that went on around me, where I was supposed to just supply the money, by the way, in this equation. They came to me for the money. And then I listened to these people talking about book rights, movie rights, journalistic prizes they were going to win because of this information. And, I looked at all of them and I said to them, you do realize that what we're holding in our hands is the future of this country. The time at which I came into possession of that drive was 6 months before the ANC electoral conference, where Jacob Zuma was up for election or re-election. His wife was actually up for re-election against Cyril Ramaphosa, who is the kind of good president, if you like. So I said to them, this drive, this information has political implications, economic implications to our country, legal implications. And you are sitting around me here talking about prizes you're going to win and who is going to play you in movies. Are you all crazy? And, they took their copy of the drive and they didn't know that I took a copy. Whereas my attitude to this was, well, the only person who put any money on the table was me. So, the person that pays owns. And then realizing that a lot of people would look at something like this, not as an opportunity to do good, but rather as an opportunity for self-promotion. I actually didn't think I had a choice. So no, there was no looking back. I just had to find a mechanism, and the best possible mechanism for doing something with this information. And it's not that, I immediately knew what to do with it. I literally employed top counsel in South Africa. I mean, they met with me in the middle of the night, on proviso that I signed NDAs. I would never disclose which legal firms represented me. And, I sought counsel and, and eventually I landed up in various interesting places. I landed up in Sweden speaking to the national kind of journalistic, it's the guys who broke the Panama Papers story, because I thought maybe they could help me. And they said, yes, but it's a lot of work. It's 500,000 emails. It would take us a while. Okay, we didn't have a while. Then I met a fantastic lawyer, William Boudon, who works in Paris, and he works with Edward Snowden and whistleblowers in Africa. And he took me, okay, this is not public knowledge, this is a bit where. So this is where I got to meet the FBI, and this is where I got to meet MI6, because I had to do something with this drive. And obviously I couldn't take it to authorities in South Africa, so I took it to authorities internationally. And again, met had some incredible experiences, and MI6 didn't look anything like James Bond. I was so disappointed. But but basically the cleverest thing to do with that information and for the protection of everyone and protection of lives was to democratize it. And so that's what I did.
So Magda, you have lots of questions coming in the chat, so I'm going to try and be very concise and succinct. So 2 questions from Dean. What in your upbringing, do you think disposes you to social good versus other things? And have you ever received threats from competitors or other companies you've worked with in the past over your quest for social good?
So on the threat side, oh, absolutely. I received threats. Look, I didn't, and I'm under no delusion, given that I was, one of 38 South Africans placed under illegal state surveillance by Zuma. Under no illusion that they went aware eventually of my involvement, maybe not all the details of my involvement. So I received, I'm quite active on Twitter. I received death threats, lots of death threats. There were memes put up of me alleging, I'm a prostitute. There were mock-up images of me, fake stories planted in the news. So quite a bit of that. And then competitors usually masquerading as bots. So absolutely, Sygnia has been a very successful company. I mean, part of it has been, we, since 2006, managed money on an index passive, low-cost basis, lowest fees in South Africa. Then we latched onto these themes of disruption, digital innovation. So obviously that doesn't make us very popular with competitors because we're growing very quickly. So competitors are continuously taking digs. So, the term that we use at Sygnia is Magda's haters. And, I think in the South African context, because of what I do, it's not all good. I'm quite a polarizing figure, if that makes sense. So there's almost no one that has a neutral opinion of me. You have people who absolutely love what I do and what I stand for, and people who absolutely hate what I am and what I stand for. So I get that from both sides. And then in terms of my upbringing and social good, a few years ago, and it was a very interesting comment, a few years ago, I employed someone in the financial services industry who spent 16 years in prison. He was imprisoned at the age of 16 for quite a horrific crime, but while he was in prison, he studied, he got 2 PhDs, one in computer science. And, when I employed him at Sygnia, it caused a bit of a furor. But when I met with him, I was more interested. I wasn't really interested in the crime. I was really interested in the rehabilitation and what kind of a person goes through a South African jail system, survives it, and emerges with 2 PhDs. And you can imagine that South African jail system is horrific. And I just thought that made him into an amazing person who deserved a chance. But anyway, obviously, as you can imagine, that caused a bit of a thing at Sygnia. And in order to help people adjust to the idea that they're not going to be killed by anyone with a machete in the parking garage, I employed a criminal psychologist to help people adjust to the concept that you actually can rehabilitate people and can be generous towards others, even if they've paid their debt to society. And that criminal psychologist, at the end of the process of interviewing all the people and counseling, and I wanted to have an interview with me. And he said to me, actually, he wants to find out the most interesting thing for him, because he has never seen a corporate employing someone emerging out of a prison system. It just doesn't happen. And he says, there were so many people that in his life that he has encountered who are not sociopaths or psychopaths, who are just people caught up in bad situations, but potentially not of their own making, who, if they had been given a chance, could have, led very productive lives, but they've never been given a chance because of what they did. So he just wanted to know my story and because he needs to understand me psychologically in terms of what makes me make the choices I make. And having listened to my story, his short answer was, he thinks that because I had such a non-linear childhood, that is what makes me do things differently, things that other people might not do. And that kind of made sense to me. Most linear childhoods are childhoods where you have a stable family, where you have stable group of friends, where you go to school, exactly where you're going to go to high school, exactly what you're going to study. You have the financial means, your parents provide you with all of that, with the financial means, with the support. Non-linear childhoods are the zigzag of having to grow up very quickly and then kind of fend for yourself. And I guess that's it, it's and also growing up in South Africa, seeing this tremendous, not being born here, so not being brought up with the belief that what I'm seeing here is normal. I was brought up in a system where everyone was equal. So remember, my upbringing is communism. My upbringing is everyone has very little, but everyone has the same. And then I emerged and arrived in South Africa, where you had the white elite who had a lot, and the black masses of the population who had zero, lived in townships, in shacks, with paraffin lights. And I think, the contrast between the two systems couldn't have been greater in my mind. No, literally couldn't have been greater. And I think that's, one of the driving forces.
That's so fascinating. So Fahim had a quick question.
Thank you very much, Magda, for such a powerful and candid personal story. I'm a recent MBA grad and also a medical doctor like your parents. Just a quick question around, obviously your story has been much about navigating powerful and political individuals. And I'd be interested to hear some advice as to how you were able to manage those kind of relationships, and in particular, through the lens of investment management, how important was that for your success? Thank you.
I think, so my favorite subject at university was macroeconomics, actually, because, in macroeconomics, you see the entire world. And the entire world, economics are not just economics. Economics are politics. I mean, it's the convergence and convergence of economics and politics. That's really what shapes the world. And, you can see it playing itself out on the global stage right now in the context of vaccines and Europe going crazy around blockages, export blockages. So you can literally explain everything that happens in the world through the lens of macroeconomics and politics. And then, if you then translate that knowledge and understanding into investments, that makes you actually, quite a successful investment person. So, many people focus on the small things of analyzing companies, and whereas I've always focused on the big picture. I actually don't care whether one company is better than another. I focus on the big trends and the big shifts. And that has given me, and that kind of study of globe, and I've always, I've never narrowed myself down to South Africa. I actually always said South Africa is fairly irrelevant in the context of investments. What happens in South Africa is a function of what happens on the global stage, again, politically, economically. So I've been a very avid studier of politics and economics. It's literally a daily preoccupation of mine. Guessing what politicians are thinking, guessing what economists are thinking, talking to people, gathering that knowledge, and having that combination of understanding politics and understanding economics, and at the same time never trying to take sides. Well, except for getting rid of Zuma, which was an essential issue. That has given, and the fact that I'm blunt. I am completely and absolutely blunt, and I'm completely blunt with politicians. So I sit with cabinet ministers where everyone is going, minister this and minister that. And I go, John, Trevor, I couldn't imagine myself growing Lennon behind me. I could not imagine myself curtsy to a queen. It just kind of would not happen. I said I could never be introduced to Queen Elizabeth because it's not going to happen. Everyone is equal. So I think the fact that I'm blunt, I'm honest, I'm objective, I don't take sides, and I don't try to profiteer, from my access to politicians. And that's a very important thing. I found myself in a very interesting position of a couple of months ago, being South Africa's chief negotiator for procurement of the vaccine, because South Africa has done nothing. So needless to say, nothing. So I tried to procure the vaccines for South Africa from Serum Institute of India. It's a long story, but in that process, and this was before they figured out that AstraZeneca might not actually be that effective for South African strain, and hence decided not to buy AstraZeneca vaccine. But in that process, I came across a lot of people who just wanted to profiteer from the vaccine, and who couldn't believe that I would get involved in this process with no commercial motive whatsoever. Absolutely none. I was there to try and negotiate the maximum amount of doses for South Africa at the minimum possible price. Despite the fact that on our investment side of the business, We are actually big investors in AstraZeneca and in the spin-out, which owns the IP behind the AstraZeneca vaccine. And someone there actually said to me, Magda, you do realize you're negotiating against us, in negotiating the price down, you're actually negotiating against your own investment. And I said, I don't care. You know, in a space of a pandemic, you've got to be genuine to yourself. And, you know, I never put the profit motive at the forefront. It's actually somewhere at the back. I mean, it's nice if it happens, but it's not what drives me.
So,
and I think
Magda,
politicians appreciate that.
Very much. Thank you.
So Magda, we could be here all day with you. There are so many questions coming in. Unfortunately, we have to let our students go to class. That little thing they come to CBS for. But we just wanted to thank you on behalf of all our co-sponsors for being here and sharing this candid and honest and open experience that you've lived through. We can't thank you enough for being here with us this morning. And Professor Weiss, thank you so much for your moderation and for helping us curate this event. So for all those first-year students, you will see in the chat box that we have dropped the PPIL event reflection form, if you could please fill that out. And I just have one final last question, Magda, before we let you go. Can you tell us one thing that you're excited for in the future?
Oh, I'm excited about a lot of things in the future. I think that we're living through, I mean, you know, take aside the pandemic, because I think that there will be, you know, a lot of reverberations and consequences of what we're living through now. But what I'm excited about is, I'm excited about disruption. I'm excited about innovation. I think, you know, what I'm excited about is that technology right now is driving down the cost of everything. It's making things that we couldn't imagine possible. Everything from, you know, early cancer detection in terms of CRISPR technologies to electrical vehicles and climate change to, you know, we investors in a company which has found a way of increasing crop yield by between 20 to 30%. So imagine the impact on climate change and Amazon rainforests if you can, you know, increase crop yield production. So I think there has never been a more exciting time to be alive than right now, despite the COVID situation, because we are living through incredible times of change, and it's change for the better. It's making things that were unaffordable, affordable, impossible, possible. And it's all for the good of humankind. So, you know, I am incredibly excited to be in the space. I'm very excited to be involved in a venture capital business right now, which has a focus on life sciences rather than technology, but it has a focus on innovation. And, you know, I think that, you know, we are all, once this is past us, are going to see incredible things happen in this world. And so, you know, I really would be excited for the future, despite the difficult times that we kind of have to survive.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for joining us today, and please enjoy and be safe and well. And we will speak to you all soon. Thanks again.